The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, guys, let's get going with tonight's webinar. And at the end, we'll just open it up for questions, I guess, through the questions box, because we're recording this and have it available for coaches in the future. We decided to keep the audio off of this, but feel free to shoot the questions away throughout the webinar, and then towards the end, I'll address all of them, and we'll stay on as long as we need. It shouldn't be too long of a talk here tonight. I'm just going to review some of the specific things related to Kogan's approaches to training stress management that I did during our December meeting in 2018. I'll probably go into a little bit more detail here just because we have a little bit more time. And I'll also review some examples with at least one example athlete here so we can put some reality next to it. All right, so I'm going to move through these slides first. So just as a reminder, when we look at Kogan's approach to training stress management, which is basically the performance management chart and feature on training peaks, this is a reactive way to track training stress. The way that QT2 is always approached the ability to track training stress is really through proactive periodization. So one is very proactive in nature. The other one is a little bit more reactive in nature. It doesn't mean you can't be a little bit proactive, which I'll go over later here in this presentation. You can be a little bit proactive with training stress management using the Kogan methods, but in general, it's more of a reactive approach. So just to formalize that, you think back 15 years ago, we were creating detailed periodization plans to help manage the athlete's stress, and early on in our coaching philosophy development, we understood what reasonable progressions would look like in periodization plans so that athletes wouldn't get injured and they'd remain healthy and make progress throughout the season. Those are the increases in training stress, or the slopes that you see in our histograms that still exist today. We understood that those were reasonable. So generally, athletes would stay very safe from an injury standpoint as long as they were following what we asked them to do. Likewise, we have taper programs that are built into the periodization programs that we know for different types of athletes, whether it be aerobic, anaerobic, or more neutral, which taper scheme is best for them so that they can race sharp, okay? So we built all that stuff into the periodization. We then prescribe the training stress or training program based upon the periodization plan, and hopefully it all works out. That all sounds fine and dandy, but the reality is that athlete gets sick, then what do? How do you adjust the periodization? Athlete has a little niggle, so you can't hit the taper exactly how you want. So then what do you do to adjust it? Or race week, a bike doesn't get delivered. How do you adjust things? That's where, you'd have to rely on coaching experience and intuition to make decisions if you're using purely a periodization-based approach. The nice thing about using Kogan's training stress training management tools is that you can more quantitatively make those adjustments or help utilize some of these philosophies to be intelligent when you make adjustments to a training program that has changed. Plus, you can just track it, even if you're using detailed periodization with the athlete, you can just track it as a second check to make sure everything is reasonable. So a lot of good values here to this type of thing. And 10 years ago, it wasn't at all practical to utilize these, even though a lot of this existed back then. It wasn't practical yet. Athletes just weren't as meticulous as they are now, utilizing the GPS devices and all of the things that you need to make this actually work. Because the reality is, if you miss 1 or 2 runs or 1 or 2 bikes a week, or 1 week you do, 1 week you don't, it significantly impacts the data that you get, and therefore it's not as accurate. You may not be making judgments on things that are happening in reality. You're just making judgments on things that are happening, which obviously is flying the plane blind a bit. So only recently, in my opinion, has the Garmin's been prevalent enough with athletes and been easy enough to download and all those things, so that there's many athletes who are pretty much 100% compliant and really enter every session, gets uploaded automatically. So now this stuff has become a little bit more practical, and that's why we thought it's important to go over it, because out of a portfolio of 10 or 15 athletes that you may coach, maybe half of them are really tracking all of their training metrics on a daily basis, utilizing their Garmin or other smart device that's uploading automatically. So that's really important. Lesson number 1 here. You need to make sure the athlete is 100% meticulous if you're going to rely on this stuff. That doesn't mean they can't miss a session. If they miss a session, you either need to notice that it was missed and enter a TSS score to the best of your estimate, or you need them to. It's not very difficult to do that. Once you have enough workouts from an athlete, you start to know that, okay, a 1 hour bike ride at zone 1 is worth about this much TSS. If it was 2 hours, you multiply by 2. Or if a zone R run is worth about this, and they miss a zone R run in terms of utilizing their device, you go ahead and backfill in the TSS for them. So, even if they're not perfect, you as the coach can go through the schedule each week and just make sure all the TSS values are there. And for those that are missing, you just enter them, just take your best guess. If you're off a little bit here or there, it's not going to make a big difference. Obviously, the bigger sessions, like a 5 hour training ride or 4 hour training ride, those are the important ones to make sure that they're in there, okay? Okay, so moving forward here, Training Peaks also allows you to retroactively adjust. So remember here, for these things to be accurate, the threshold value needs to be accurate in Training Peaks. And I'll go through it in a minute here and show that so that you see where that is. And actually, I may just go ahead and do that now while we're on the topic. So I'll go through a couple examples here. So we're going to use Tripp's calendar here tonight as our example athlete. I checked with him, and he was okay if we did that. So, here's Tripp's performance management dashboard. This is how I like to set it up. I've set mine up this way for the last 3 or 4 years. I put his performance management chart right up at the top. And remember, once you set this up once, it stays this way for you for all of your athletes. By default, it's got swim, bike, and run included, although there are times when you do want to change that, and we'll go through that here tonight in a minute too. I then like to put peak power curves for the bike. So you'll notice I do a 1 year look back, which is the gray, and then a more recent 3-month look back. The reason why I do that is it's a really simple way for you as the coach to say, how's my athlete doing? Are they producing powers on the bike that are at least the same or better than last year, right? Ideally, and I'm colorblind here, you got to help me out, but this purple magenta color, ideally that's all you would see here. That would mean that his bike this year in the last 3 months is stronger than anything over the last year. So I always like to have that set up there, okay? And you can figure out how to adjust these. You go to the menu and you can change the date ranges there. It's not very difficult. Then I like to show actual swim volume, okay? Bike volume, and when I say volume, I mean distance, and then run distance, because typically in our periodization, we're mostly using duration. It's kind of nice to see distance as a different flavor periodically and just see how they're doing with regard to those. And then I like to do a total down here, okay? So, and that's duration, by the way. So this is essentially your actual histogram, right? You have your periodization plan, which is the plan. This is the actual. Ideally, the gray is also your plan. You're technically prescribing everything based upon the periodization. So in a perfect world, the gray would reflect exactly your periodization plan. So that's the way that I like to set this up. These are the metrics that I like to view. So I kind of got on the side just showing you how to set this up, but let's take a look at how to backfill. That was why I got on the screen in the first place. So if you believe that your athletes had upload data, maybe they've come to you from another coach, and they've been really meticulous about utilizing their Garmin. All their data is up here, but you don't know if their threshold was set right backwards. You can go ahead and backfill that. So you click the menu button here, and you see this Recalculate TSS. You click that, and then you can set thresholds, okay? And then you can pick a date range. Let's see, why is this? It's giving me a little trouble. It's stuck there for some reason. Hold on. Let's move that out of the way. So you can come in here and set a date range for which you'd like to backfill and correct the threshold so that this chart corrects itself. So you can go back, I think, up to a year and backfill. You just need to do no larger than 1 year chunks at a time. So you can go back further than a year if you wanted to. You just pick the dates that you want to go back. You pick the sport. I usually do one sport at a time. I find that if you try to take on too much, it crashes. So I usually do one sport at a time. You set the threshold where you'd like it to be, and then you click Recalculate. And what that does is it goes back and recalculates this performance management chart based upon the threshold that you specify for the date range that you specify. But if you're just moving forward and you're not worried about fixing anything historical, you just need to make sure your thresholds are set correctly under zones here for the athlete. So if you scroll down, you have this power section. This is where threshold needs to be set correctly. And then for pace, this is where pace needs to be set correctly. And then same thing for swim here. So those are the 3 primary locations where for every athlete, you need to make sure the threshold is fairly accurate at any given point. And remember, this is all important because TSS, which is the training stress score on a workout per workout basis, is based upon the training load applied during a single training session relative to threshold. That's why that's so important. So if the threshold wasn't set correctly for a period of time, the TSS scores are going to be wrong, and then therefore that changes the ATLs, the CTLs, and the TSB. So the chart just won't look right. It won't be a good indicator of where the athlete has been, so that it'll make it difficult for you to compare now to where they have been. So that's the only reason why you'd want the ability to go back and recalculate those. As long as you're just working forward, you need to make sure that the thresholds are set correctly in this area that I just showed, which again is under the athlete, and then zones. As long as those are set correctly, here, here, and here, then everything will theoretically run just fine. Periodically, you get a bad device or a bad power meter that'll show a crazy TSS score for one workout. To fix that, you'll usually see that TSS dot, which is this darker red dot, way higher than anything else. If you just click on it, it'll bring up the workout. You can click on it, and then you just delete the TSS score, re-estimate it based on what you know it should have been, and then that'll fix it. Because when you get a bad power meter, what happens is it'll also skew this whole chart, right? It'll make that one workout's power numbers will be so high it'll dwarf anything. So just going through some troubleshooting here so you know if something goes wrong, you know how to fix it. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. So those are some of the basics. Continuing forward here though, so TSS is kind of the fundamental piece of all this. That's the training stress score for any given session. It's per session and it's versus threshold stress or threshold power, pace, whatever it may be. Realize that theoretically 1 hour at exactly the athlete's threshold equals a TSS of 100. So if it's only a 35-minute zone R run, it's probably going to be a TSS of like 30, right? Because they're well below threshold and it was only 30 minutes versus an hour, right? So that just gives you some feel for what these TSS numbers mean. All the ATL is really a summation. It's a little bit more complex than just a summation, but for the purposes of this discussion, assume it's just a summation of the prior 7 days of TSS scores, okay? So they call that ATL or acute training load. So obviously if you apply 7 days of very high intensity, long duration workouts of high TSS each, that's going to be a high ATL, high acute training load. Another term for this would be fatigues, right? If you do 7 days of really hard or long training, high volume, you're going to be very fatigued at the end of that. You're going to find that ATL is very high, okay? And just to show you on the chart here, so where's ATL? ATL is this magenta color, right? So here Tripp did a lot of high TSS training sessions. These are all these red dots. And therefore, at the end of that 7-day period, his ATL was the highest it's been all season, right? It just so happens that Sunday was the end of our pro camp in Claremont, which he was at. So he had a very high ATL, over 200. And honestly, I look at ATL the least. I don't look at that really at all because ATL, the amount of ATL or acute level training that an athlete can handle is really a function of how much chronic training they've done, meaning an athlete can handle a lot higher ATL if their CTL is very high, their chronic training load. So in simple terms, if you've been training 15 hours a week for the last 20 weeks, and then you put in an 18-hour week, yeah, you'll be fatigued, but it's not going to be devastating. Conversely, if the athlete was training only 5 hours a week for 20 weeks and they put in an 18-hour week, well, they would be devastated, right? The ATL would be the same between those two athletes because it was still an 18-hour week for the last 7 days, except that one athlete had a much lower CTL. So that's why I honestly don't look at ATL very much at all. It's still important, and you'll understand in a minute why, but it's not a metric to really look at on a regular basis. Okay, CTL is chronic training load. So it's just like ATL, except it's the last 6 weeks of TSS scores. So this gives you a really good feel for, how much training and fitness the athlete may have. And, for those of you that have been with QT2 or QT2 brand of coaching for a long period of time, you know that we've always looked at what I used to call 6-week trailing volume. Well, it turns out CTL is almost exactly that. The difference is CTL takes into account the intensity of the session versus threshold, where 6-week trailing volume didn't. However, I will tell you that volume is by far the biggest driver of all this. And even if you do a really intense session on a Thursday, chances are you're going to go pretty light on a Friday. So it all kind of balances out. It's actually very close to 6-week trailing volume. So anyhow, a kind of a broader look at how much training stress an athlete has applied to themselves over the last 6-week period. It's a good indicator of fitness at that point. So where is CTL on our chart? CTL is the one that's shaded. So that's the main one that's shaded. Tells you how fit the athlete is. So here in Tripp's case, you can see, he took an off season after racing Ironman Louisville, I believe this was. A deep reduction in CTL because he took a break. And then we've been building back since then. And now he's kind of at peak form, or at least relative to where he's been this year so far, and also back up to where he was last year. Now, we have a few weeks before Ironman Boulder for him, so I'm looking forward to hopefully getting CTL a bit higher than he was last year, which would mean technically we applied more training stress over the last 6 weeks than we did last year. However, realize that this year his threshold is already a bit higher. So therefore, his fitness from a speed standpoint is actually better, even though the CTL is the same. So that's the nice thing about this. Just because a CTL for an athlete is 100 doesn't mean they're faster than the next person. Everything's relative to their own threshold. So as long as you're changing the thresholds for your athletes as you move forward in a general way, all this stuff is kind of unitless. So the best athletes in the world may have a CTL of 190 when they go to race their key Ironman race and go, 7 hours and 40 minutes or something crazy. But you may have an age group athlete who's 50 years old who also has a CTL of 180 or 190 who goes 15 hours, right? It can happen. I mean, if there's a good chance that the CTL is that high, they've done a lot of training and they're a little bit faster, but not necessarily guaranteed. So everything's relative to the athlete's own threshold, and that's why it becomes more of a tracker of volume of training, honestly. Not exactly, but that is by far the biggest driver. So there's CTL on our chart. Again, it's the darker one with the area under the curve. Okay. All right. So that brings us to TSB. In my opinion, CTL and TSB are where it's at. You're generally not going to look at TSS per training session. You're not going to look at ATL on a weekly basis or anything like that. But CTL is a good indicator of aggregate fitness, that broader look at things. And training stress balance is probably one of the biggest values to utilizing this. And training stress balance is really about how rested the athlete is relative to their normal training load. So it's the difference. An easy way to think about it is the difference between CTL and ATL. So what this means is if the athlete is very, very fit, meaning their CTL is high, and then they take a lighter training week, maybe the same light training week that they did 6 months prior, this would result in a much higher TSB than it did 6 months prior, just because their chronic training load is so high. The same rest week that they've always done will result in a higher TSB, right? Because that acute training load is now lower on a relative basis than and larger basis than the CTL. Okay, so this really is about how rested the athlete is relative to their normal training load. That would be a good way to think about it. So where is TSB on our chart? TSB is this orange color. And if you just hover over any of these points, it gives you all these metrics, so you know exactly where the athlete is. So you can see Tripp here, after a tougher training weekend, you can see he's negative. So a negative number means we've applied more acute training load relative to his chronic training load, and therefore he's very fatigued. So a good break-even threshold there is a 0. You can consider an athlete pretty well rested if they're back to a 0. If they're negative, they're a bit fatigued. If they're very positive, meaning a 20 or a 30, it means they're very rested. So it's good to understand that, all right? We'll talk more about how to juggle that here in a minute. All right, moving forward. So starting with going back to CTL and kind of starting with that for our deep dive, as I mentioned, CTL and TSB are by far the key things to look at here. So I'm going to focus mostly on those. So what are kind of the maximum CTLs in the sport of triathlon? About a 40 swim, about a 100 bike, and then about a 55 run. That's about as high as anyone would ever get, and that would generally be someone that's training 25 to 30 hours on a very regular basis. These are your world-class professionals in most cases. I'm sure some age groupers do it too, but it's mostly capped by logistics. Again, it's unitless, so it's not about speed of the athlete, right? Because it's all relative to their own threshold, all right? So those are the maximums. In my opinion, these are kind of the minimums for most triathletes to be fit, particularly if they're doing half Ironman and Ironman racing. Those are kind of the minimums that we should get athletes to truly be ready for their race or develop a good portion of their current potential. Some key notes here on the side, though. If you're dealing with a single sport athlete, you could generally go about 20% higher than these. So the world-class, really top level cyclists get the CTL to 120 on the bike. On the run, they get the CTL up to 65, 70 range. So just to give you some ideas, right? And even for minimums, I think those are good targets too. If you're having someone go to marathon who's maybe a first-time marathoner who's only running, you could add about 20% to this number and try to get them to that 40 to 50 range, right? So these are good just rules of thumb on CTL. And in the past, comparing this to some of our rules of thumb on critical volume, these tie together very well with all those things. Just another way to look at it. Another key point here is to give back about 50% of the peak CTL once a year. That's typically your end of the year break. So you'll notice here that in Tripp's case, he peaked out CTL at about 163 last year in training for Louisville. Louisville was this very high TSS value that single day, right? So that's a good lesson too to show that an Ironman gets that point well above any other day on this chart. But his peak CTL was, about 3 weeks prior to the race, and we peaked out at 163. You notice that at the bottom here, he got down to about 86. So there you go. We dropped off about 50% CTL to get fully recovered before starting to build up for the next season. So all that is pretty customary and a good example. All right, moving forward. So let's talk about TSB a little bit. How do we vary TSB on a regular basis? One great use for TSB is to use it as a metric not to get athletes injured. Anytime an athlete gets injured, usually for the run in particular, you typically see a TSB value that's like negative 30 or lower, negative 40, negative 50. It just means you ramp things up too quickly one particular week without any base underneath them yet. So it's a very safe metric to utilize. However, you wouldn't want to sit at negative 25 for 8 weeks. That would probably result in injury as well. So these are good minimums to try to avoid injury that I show here. And then also going back to zero about every 3 to 4 weeks. Make sure you get back to zero. That's that meso level recovery that athletes just need. So you'll notice here, if I just switch this to run on Tripp's chart, let's just take a look here. So you can see here, you could slice it down, to single sports, but the most negative Tripp got here was a 24. Here he's been at 22. So we got close to kissing off 25 a few times, but you'll also notice that about every 3 or 4 weeks, you can see here he pops back above zero, right? That was 4.9. This was 2.20. So we actually probably went almost 6 weeks, let's say. No, these were zeros too. So about every 3 or 4 weeks, we were back to zero. So you can see it's very safe, and he's had no injuries, nothing like that. So a very safe way to manage the training stress so they're not getting hurt. And now, realize that in this case, he also had a periodization plan that we were prescribing the sessions from. So given our periodization plans are very reasonable, they have the right slopes, these metrics should come out correctly, and they do. It goes back to zero about every 3 or 4 weeks, never got more negative than negative 25, so all very good. And honestly, I didn't even check these before this webinar tonight. I just asked Tripp if I could use his account. And you can see here that this wasn't staged at all. He just got down to negative 24, never got down below 25. All right. All right, so those are keys on TSB, at least from an injury perspective, which is one important use for those. The other super important and really valuable area for TSB, this is the area that I use these performance metrics the most by far. I utilize TSB for peaking for races. It is really, really useful. That was one thing that was always difficult in my mind, particularly if it was a more aerobic athlete. Ever since I've started using the training metrics from Kogan and utilizing TSB to make sure we nail the tapers, it's been much more consistent performances from all athletes. I wake up on race morning and I feel pretty confident that the athletes are going to be so-called on that day. assuming sleep's been good, nutrition's been good, you kind of take the training piece off of it here. So what are some ideals? Ideals for bike run are like 5 to 25. That is, when I say bike run, I mean if I have both bike and run checked here as combined, 5 to 25 for race day is really good for those types of athletes. So you can see Tripp here, when he did Louisville last year, and he was certainly on that day, his combined bike run was a 28 TSB. And Tripp is a little bit more of a neutral athlete. So, you'll see here that I say ideals for race day are 5 to 25 for aerobic and 30 to 50 for anaerobic. Tripp's kind of neutral, so a 28 was like perfect for him. So that makes a lot of sense. And remember, lower in the range for 70.3 versus Ironman, meaning you want to be more rested for Ironman than you do want to be sharp for 70.3. The other key for race day, if it's a key race, is to drop about 10% of the CTL from the peak, 3 to 4 weeks out for anaerobic, 2 to 3 weeks out for aerobic. So again, going to trips, let's see how he did. So he was doing Ironman Louisville. At his peak CTL, he was a 122. And on race day, he was 115. So that is pretty darn close. Let's just see. I'm sorry, you have to check the day before. That's another thing to realize. The day you do the session, the CTL increases, but TSB doesn't increase until the day after. That's one thing you'll notice, so just keep that in mind. But we went down a CTL of 103 from a 122. So we actually dropped more than 10% in his case. And I actually don't mind dropping a little bit more for the more neutral or anaerobic athletes versus the aerobic athletes. Generally, the aerobic athletes, you want to stay closer to the peak. And that's also why I say 2 to 3 weeks out for aerobic, 3 to 4 weeks out for anaerobic. All right. So that's that routine. And these are the real important numbers. Here I break it down. Aerobic, they typically feel the best on the bike if they're negative 10 to 5 TSB for 70.3, negative 5 to 15 for Ironman. And what I've done is I actually keep a sheet on the side. I keep mine in OneNote. For each of my athletes, I write out for 70.3, here's where they're best. For Ironman, here's where they're best. So I have a little cheat sheet for all the athletes I coach that I've learned. I went back through their Training Peaks accounts. I've looked back to a race on here that they did really well at. I checked the run TSB, I checked the bike TSB, and you very quickly start to see a trend so that I remember now. I just write them on the side. But if you don't have your athletes written out yet, you can look back. That would be one way to do it. If you can't look back for any reason, then just use these rules of thumb for starters until you get honed in more. And then you just write it down, and they take the guessing game out of it. So as you're getting 10 days out from the race with the athlete, you're referencing what TSBs you're targeting. And then you can actually forecast it, which is what I have here. And I want to show this. This is an important feature. So if I come to Tripp's chart here and maximize it, just so we can focus on this for a minute, and then change the duration. I'm going to change it from 365 days. I'm going to change it to the last 90 days and next 20. So this is a really nice feature. So what that does is it forecasts out. So here's the actuals up until this date, and then these are all forecasts based on what I have in his schedule. So what you can do is, if I just switch over to his training schedule now, let's see. So if I come to his training schedule, let's just say this was a race week coming up. What I can do is I can drop in a session, and I actually do this all the time, at least 7 to 10 days out from a race. You can go ahead and drop in a session. And then what you can do is you can look at the session and say, okay, it's a 1 hour zone 1 run. You'll know from prior runs what it works out. And usually for most athletes, 1 hour at zone 1 will give you about 1 TSS per minute. So that's a 60. So what I can do is I can put on the planned column 60. So what you'll see here is it actually puts the TSS value in there. So now we can take a look. Let's just take a look at the TSS on the 15th. I'll just strip this down to the run only. I'm sorry, the CTL or TSB on the 15th. So on the 15th, you can see it's a negative 16 forecast based on what I have in there now. So negative 16, just remember that. So now if I come in here and I take this out and come back, just gonna hit the refresh button here. I lost my chart. So what I could do now is I go to the 15th And see it's a -9. So it was a -16 when I had that session in there. So it shows you the TSB actually adjusts based on what you forecast. So that's why I say when you go ahead and put your race week in for the athlete, you could go ahead and fill out all the TSS numbers for all the workouts that you have in there, and then you can hover over race day on here. Let's say it was a Saturday race. You could see what the run TSB is going to be for the race. So you can literally tune in and tweak the race week sessions, the durations of those sessions and quantity and all those to make sure that you're going to hit the TSB that you know works for that athlete on race day. It's really valuable. So I usually go through that for swim, bike, and run. You'll notice I don't have the swim on here because the swim is very variable. It's the least accurate because just simply based upon the duration that they do for a swim or input into Training Peaks and how much distance they cover. It still can work if you get to feel a good feel for your athlete's swim TSB numbers for race day that you know work, then you can go ahead and tune them in. You know, the athlete is at least consistent in the way they enter their sessions in terms of how much duration they put for a distance that they do, then you can go ahead and fill out the TSS scores for race week as well and tune those in. So that was kind of my last point here in terms of forecasting TSB in Training Peaks, at least a week out from race day. And then you nail the taper, right? You nail it. It works really, really well. Some of the other stuff that we're accustomed to doing, like off days, 2 weeks out, and things like that, and the way you manage the taper, still all do that stuff, but this certainly allows you that final 7 to 10 days to really tweak it to nail it for the athlete. Or like I said earlier, if something goes wrong and they end up taking 2 weeks out from the race off because they got sick, you may need to add some training stress back the prior weekend and during race week to get the TSB down to where it should be to get their system opened back up. So that's where this stuff becomes really, really valuable because it allows you to do that on the fly. Here I just wanted to show our taper schemes. These are our kind of standard taper schemes. But again, remember, we had a taper that was for long course or anaerobic athletes. Again, a longer taper, which would technically allow that TSB to come up quite high. And like I mentioned earlier, anaerobic athletes do better with the higher TSBs. This is 1 week shorter, this taper. That would be good for a neutral athlete. And then our very short taper here, which is for the aerobic athlete, that would result in a TSB that's lower or maybe even negative for race day. But these types of athletes perform well when it's like that. We also say for short course, that would mean that the athlete probably doesn't have as high of a training volume. Therefore, you just don't need as long of a taper, okay? So I just wanted to show those because they tie in well with what we've talked about here. I think these are the main things that I want to discuss. We discussed how to set up the dashboard in total. We discussed what all the training metrics mean. We discussed how to go back and backfill improper thresholds for athletes that you may not have it correct, either because they came to you from another coach, or maybe you weren't using this prior, or they didn't have the right threshold set prior. You can go back and backfill the TSS based on a corrected threshold. I showed how to set thresholds properly so that going forward, TSS scores are calculated properly. And then we also talked about how to taper and utilize TSB and even forecast it forward so that you're more assured that your athlete will arrive on the starting line in a sharp place so that they so-called have legs, right? So I think that's it. I think that's everything I wanted to cover tonight. Hopefully this was helpful. I'm going to go ahead and open up the questions box here. So if anyone has any questions, just punch them in there. And we'll take our time. And again, you know, all these metrics, everything that I've covered here is great for triathletes, great for runners, great for cyclists. You could use it across all of our brands. It's not that this is for one person or another. I mean, I helped Matt Kerbeau about a year ago or 6 months ago, helped him hone in on why some days he was having legs and some days not. And he's been 100%, you know, cyclist and cycling at a high level. And it was really quick and easy for us to see why the days that the race days that he had legs, he was hitting a certain TSB number. The days he didn't have legs, he wasn't, you know, so it was pretty good to hone in on that. So again, you can use it across the board. And I think I've showed here tonight how to use it even for the single sport athletes in terms of, you know, adding 20% to the CTL numbers, and the TSB numbers actually wouldn't be impacted for the single sport athletes. All right, well, I'm not showing any questions, so hopefully that means that I've answered most of the questions out there. Either that or I've bored everyone to death. But regardless, we have this webinar now. It's been totally recorded. We'll have it up in the coach reference area here shortly, I'm sure. And if anyone has any other questions that you think of, just feel free to reach out, of course. Thanks so much. Happy Mother's Day.